In episode 2, I proposed that we should get a few bass fishermen together and pick out a mountain that nobody's using and carve it into the heads of 4 great heroes of topwater bass fishing. And I proposed that the first head we should carve up there should be the head of Grover Cox, who helped invent the Zara spook. Well, this week I'm going to propose another hero that we can carve up on Mount Fishmore next to Grover. His name is Fred Arbogast, and his lure is the jitterbug. We're talking about plastic again, and today we're talking about Akron, Ohio, USA. And we have to begin with a discussion about cartels. Now, if you watch a lot of network TV, you hear those talking heads babbling about the wonders of free enterprise and free trade. But those big companies, as soon as they acquire the freedom to trade, they often combine and collude into agreements among themselves to boost profits. And this is called a cartel. And most of us are aware of the oil cartel known as OPEC, but few people are aware of the first big industrial cartel, the rubber cartel. Now, the first great multinational corporation was the British East India Company. They ruled a subcontinent with a human culture that was much older than the one in England, and they turned a tidy profit for a handful of investors. The East India Company filed the first international grievance under the name of free trade. They had converted the subsistence farmers in India to poppy growers and opium producers, and they exported tons of opium to China while the natives starved in India. They turned millions of Chinese into opium addicts. This is called economic development. The Chinese government had ordered them to stop repeatedly, but they wouldn't. So in 1839, the Chinese government confiscated 1,000 tons of British opium in Hong Kong and burned it. Do the math, that's 2 million pounds of opium. It's just what they happened to have on hand that day. So the East India Company claimed that this was an infringement of their right to free trade, and the British government backed them up. They invaded the largest country in the world and overthrew the most ancient culture on earth, and then they installed puppet rulers who would agree to trade freely with the East India Company. Anyway, once this opium war was over and Asia was secured for free enterprise and free trade and unlimited opium shipments, the drug profits supported the company, and the company propped up the British government, including the British Navy that ruled the world, including Vancouver Island. So the British conquest and control of Vancouver Island was the direct result of drug pushers operating under the name of free trade. But I digress. Anyway, as time went on, British companies mowed down the jungle in Malaya and they planted huge rubber plantations, and they basically cornered the world market in rubber. After World War I, when the rubber market shriveled, these huge British rubber plantations were at risk of going bankrupt. So in 1920, the Free Enterprise British Rubber Growers Association turned to the Secretary of State for Colonies, a guy named Winston Churchill. And Churchill created the Rubber Investigation Committee, chaired by Sir James Stephenson. And Britain passed the Stephenson Act in 1922, which created the rubber cartel that restricted rubber production. Now, what does this have to do with bass fishing, you might ask? Well, Harvey Firestone and the other big U.S. tire makers weren't happy about the rubber cartel. It helped the British rubber plantations survive, but it also proved to be an incentive for foreign companies to develop synthetic alternatives to rubber. And this was especially important for big companies that were gearing up to promote a next world war. So Japan took a different approach toward the cartel. They said, we'll call your free trade and we'll raise you a little free enterprise. And they bombed Pearl Harbor and Malaya, and then they swept in and conquered all those rubber plantations. So just as the war was beginning, most of the nations involved lost their access to raw rubber, and they fast-tracked synthetic rubber production. And by the end of the war, The US and Germany and Russia had all invented different technologies for industrial production of synthetic rubber. But it was only in the US that these technological breakthroughs were followed through to their ultimate destiny, the creation of better bass lures. In the US, the center of rubber tire production had always been Akron, Ohio, home to Firestone, Goodyear, and B.F. Goodrich tire companies. Fred Arbogast was born in Akron. He went to work at the Goodyear factory after he graduated high school. But like all normal people, his real passion was not making tires. It was fishing. And like me, he didn't like to just sit on the bank and fish with bait. He liked to get out on the water and cast. He won competitions for casting distance and casting accuracy. He could cast a lure and knock the ash off your cigarette. In 1922, he set the world casting distance record for half-ounce lures. He was also a world-class fly caster, but we won't hold that against him. Anyway, he started making bass lures in his basement and selling them to friends. Then one day he came home and he said to his wife, "Guess what, honey? I quit my job at the tire factory and I'm going into business making bass lures." And she said, "Gee, that's wonderful, honey." So he started selling his lures through ads in magazines, and these ads often included pictures of Fred and his wife and family along with the big bass they caught on his lures. One of his early employees said the living room was the office, the dining room was the shipping center, the baits were built in the cellar and painted in the bedroom. Seems like a perfect domestic arrangement. While he was working at Goodyear, Fred got familiar with some of the rubbery, plasticky materials they were inventing. He was a pioneer in using these new soft plastics to build fishing lures. He hit the jackpot in 1936 with a lure called the Hawaiian Wiggler. It was basically just a spinner blade with a big lead body single hook. The key advance here was the ring of soft, flexible plastic doodly bobs that were attached around the hook. He called it a hula skirt because when the lure moved, the skirt wiggled like the grass skirt on a hula dancer. So here's an artist's rendition. This isn't a real hula dancer, but this will give you the idea of what it was like, right? This is the idea, the hula skirt. And he patented this hula skirt in 1938. And later, he attached this skirt to a floating popper lure called the hula popper. And this hula popper is still a great lure today, but not good enough to get me climbing up on a mountain to carve Fred's head up onto Mount Fishmore. So Fred's home business developed into a big lure making company in Akron, where he made millions of these rubber skirts. And the hula skirts were originally made from high quality material that would last for years or maybe decades, but nowadays Fred's old company, like most of the old North American lure companies, has been bought up by some faceless multinational, and the lures are made out of plastic today instead of wood, and the hula skirts have changed to a different material, and the new skirt material reacts with water and it turns to glue, and the hula fibers stick together and they get brittle and then they just fall apart. So every time you go to use a hula popper, you need to go out and buy another lure. How cool is that? Fred must be turning over in his grave. I have to make another slight digression here. We're not going to focus on poppers today, but I have to mention that the store-bought hula skirts were so poor that I decided to make my own popper lure from scratch. And it turned out to be the first successful bass lure I ever created. And it was also the first bass lure ever made out of super cypress cedar, which might be part of the reason for its success. Anyway, it was an imitation of Fred's legendary hula popper. Now, I was a fan of the TV cartoon show Ren and Stimpy at the time, where Dr. Stupid had invented his patented water-resistant Stuponatron helmet. And my popper was weird and stupid and water resistant, so I named it the Stuponatron. It had floppy rubber legs and a big marabou plume tail and huge bug eyes, and it actually caught some nice fish. Here's a nice bass caught on the Stuponatron.
Oh, that's a 4-pound smallmouth, maybe.
Oh,
That's
oh, what a fish, what a fish, what a fish.
But getting back on track, the hula popper is a great lure, but not great enough to earn Fred a spot on Mount Fishmore. This honor is due to another plug he invented, the jitterbug. Fred was trying to develop a wooden lure with a metal lip that would make it dive when he reeled it in, but it kept rolling over and planing back to the surface. So he thought, why not make it into a surface plug? This lure is the essence of simplicity. Here's one of the originals. I took this photo myself when I was in the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame in Wisconsin. It's basically just an egg-shaped piece of wood with a couple triple hooks attached and a curved piece of aluminum riveted onto the front. The lure floats, and when you reel it in, the lip rides up on one side, and then it tilts over and falls back with a soft plop, and then it rides up on the other side and plops again, ad infinitum, plop, 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 plop. It looks really stupid, and it will almost never get bit during the bright light of day, but when the light fades, it's that plop, 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 plop sound that triggers the bass to attack. When the light gets dim, the wily bass gets aggressive and careless. Unlike most trout, bass may continue to feed all night long. They may prowl the shallows and attack anything that moves on the surface. This includes big moths, dragonflies, frogs, salamanders, snakes, swimming mice and voles, even baby ducks. The jitterbug imitates the sound of a swimming mouse, and at times bass just go crazy over it. The jitterbug is the greatest nighttime bass lure ever invented, and that's the reason we're going to carve Fred Arbogast's head up onto Mount Fishmore. Well, here we are at Quesnel Lake in late July. I'm bathing in the warm glow of my Valvo's headlights. But once I head out on the lake, I'll only have my miner's headlamp.
Late July, just after midnight, at Quesnel Lake tonight. No moon, and as I'm turning the headlights up, darker, perfect time to go back. Using two words, one of them is jitterbug. The other is homemade words like a dirt scoop and flared out gill. Flared gill crashes and makes noise on the surface. The idea is same in both words. It's just get at the noise and try to fight the noise ultimately.
Well, I've got my rods rigged. Time to get out on the water. But first I need to digress again for a short moment. You know, I hope this crazy Basstravaganza serves as an inspiration to other people to get out on the water and enjoy some of the challenges and excitement that I get from fishing. But the last thing I want to do is have some 10-year-old kid watch my movie and say, wow, I'm going to go out and catch bass at night just like Humpty Dumpling, and then fall overboard without a life jacket or get run down by some drunk in a speedboat. If you go night fishing, you have to start by turning up the dial on your common sense to the max, like a rock guitarist turning up the gain on his amp. Everything gets strange on the water after dark, and the margin for error is very slim. So if you're out on a lake where there are power boats, you have to assume that anyone else out on the water after midnight is intoxicated, because they probably are. If you're out there in the dark, you're a sitting duck to get run over. So if you're in a motorboat at night, you always need to have running lights. It's not only stupid to go out without them, it's also illegal. So go read up on your safety regulations. You need a red and green running light and a white light called a mast light. And you can buy these cheap at any outdoor store. Put batteries in them, or I connect them often right to my 12-volt car, deep cycle battery. But you need to always have these lights on whenever you're out on the lake. So motor over to your spot, then kill the engine. Never shut off your lights unless you're right against the shore. Even if you're out paddling in a canoe, you need to carry lights. You can get these LCD miners headlamps pretty cheap. Some are better than others. This one's a piece of crap. Even if you don't get run down by another boat, you always have to be aware that there might be other people out there on the water, and you don't want to run into them. It's pitch black in front of you, and there might be some kids floating on a raft out there, or some hippie on a paddleboard, or God forbid, another wingnut bass fisherman throwing a jitterbug. So go slow and shine your flashlight ahead. You don't want to run people over. Actually, if it's another bass fisherman, it's okay to run them over if they're trying to sneak into your secret spot. But once you get to your spot and you know you're alone, then switch into stealth mode. I could do a whole show on boating safety at night and not cover half of it, but you people probably want to go fishing. Now, producing a TV show about night fishing is a challenge. The fish are attacking at faint noises like the sound of an insect's legs, so you have to maintain absolute silence in your approach. Any kind of visible light might spook the wily bass, so basically you're talking about a TV show that's entirely monotone black with no sound. Pretty exciting, huh? Welcome to the Basstravaganza. There'll be more night fishing on future episodes, so if you think this one's boring, you just wait. Here's my first night of GoPro bass filming. First, let me set the mood. When you first go out on the lake, it's like the data stream to your brain gets shut off. It's like you lost your connection to the internet. There's just nothing out there. I'm a big fan of SpongeBob. It's a TV documentary about marine ecology, and they had this one episode about whirly brains. They were some kind of creepy scheme invented by an evil supervillain. Kids would buy them in the toy store, and then when they opened the box, these little helicopter blades, these whirly blades, would saw around the top of their skulls and flip the top open, and then these whirly blades would attach onto your brain and suck it out along with your eyeballs and part of your spinal cord. So you were left feeling kind of senseless and stupid. And that's the way you feel when you first go out on a lake at night. There's nothing to see and there's nothing to hear. It's like the great philosopher Patrick Starr so eloquently stated, there's only the dismal abyss of black nothingness. But after a while, your brain begins to process the little tidbits of data that it's getting from your ears and your optic nerves. You start to hear things like bats' wings and cars miles away, and gradually you begin to focus on the lights of houses along shore. There's somebody else out there, alive, watching TV. It's so quiet, you can even hear the dialogue. They're watching the late night reruns of The Twilight Zone. Now, obviously it's dark and you can't see the fish bite the lure, so you have to listen. Listen patiently to the glurp, 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 glurp of the jitterbug. And wait until you hear a bass grab it off the surface. Oops, I had a bite. I've eased into one of my favorite spots, and it doesn't take long before I hear a splash and something starts pulling on my line. I turn on my headlamp. Fish on! Let me tell you, it is harder to land a bass at night than it is in daylight, especially from a pontoon boat, especially if you're an idiot and you forgot to bring your net. Now I have to reach into the water and grab this bass that's thrashing 2 triple hooks around. Are we having fun yet? Mission accomplished. My first ever Midnite GoPro bass. A nice chunky Quesnel Lake Smallie with a mouthful of jitterbug. Welcome to the Basstravaganza, Mr. Dolomew, and welcome to the brilliant invention of Mr. Fred Arbogast. Never go out at night without needle nose pliers. I like to keep mine attached to the boat with a cord. With pliers, it's easy to pop the hook out and release a fish without damaging anything but its pride. It's always good to retie a new knot after a good fish. I often use just the red bulb on my headlamp if I think there might be more fish nearby. The red light is supposed to be invisible to fish. I don't know. I'm not a fish. Okay, now I'm confident in my knot. Time to start throwing the jitterbug out again. And blammo! Pretty soon I'm into another one. But you can't see much out there in video land, can you? It looks crazy to watch, but let me tell you, it is even crazier to be out there in person. The fish is racing around under the boat or jumping in the air and thrashing around. If the fish gives a big head shake beside the boat, it might stick one of those triple hooks right into my pontoon, which is a bad thing to happen to an inflatable boat. But if I don't get this fish aboard, the Basstravaganza fans won't have a good look at how pretty it is. A shout out to Midnite Smallmouth, and a shout out to Fred Arbogast and his fantastic jitterbug. So that was the first time I tried to film night fishing. The technology was pretty primitive, just a headlamp and a GoPro. After I watched this video, I modified my boats and installed a rack with a 12-volt floodlight. It's really haywire. I don't have a switch yet, just 2 hot wires from my battery. So the plan is, Humpty will head out into the dismal abyss of black nothingness and hook a big bass. Then he'll hold onto the rod with one hand and reach back into the abyss with the other and locate the ends of the 2 hot wires. Then he'll twist them together so that the floodlight will turn on for your viewing pleasure, without touching the hot wires against the metal frame of the pontoon boat, or letting them touch the water, which might zap him. What could possibly go wrong?
The littlest one yet. Still a nice fish though. 2-pounder. A shout out to Fred Arbogast, who should be on Mount Rushmore. Fred Arbogast, the inventor of the jitterbug. The greatest nighttime bass fishing lure ever.
And there's another nice bass volunteering for the Basstravaganza, but it doesn't want to pose without a major scrap. I have my floodlight rig, but once again I forgot to bring a net. With my single hook homemade lure, it's much easier to land a fish without a net. At night, with 2 triples flailing around, I have to carefully lift the fish out of the water. It's an invitation to getting one of those hooks buried in my hand. Another dandy Dolomute. Welcome to the Basstravaganza.
Jitterbug.
Here on Van Isle, it seems to me that the hotter the weather gets, the more the bass like to hit at night. From the summer solstice in June until the middle of August is my favorite, although they might still bite in May or September.
On the very next cast, little brother of the previous one.
Once the water gets a little bit cooler, you can throw a jitterbug around at night, every night, and never get a single bite. Even though you can catch tons of bass on rubber worms or crankbaits when the water's cooler, they absolutely will not hit a topwater lure at night. But when they're in the mood to chomp a jitterbug, it can be a bizarre and unforgettable experience. After every good fish, you should take time off to decompress, have a shot of coffee, and retie your knot. It's good to drink something warm before you start to get cold, not after.
That is a dandy jitterbug smallmouth. That's a beauty. Let me tell you a little bit about red arbogast bass from Akron, Ohio. Measure that one later. Beauty smallmouth on the jitterbug.
Hey! Hey, wake up! You over there! Wake up. No dozing off during the Basstravaganza. It's 3 a.m. and here on Vancouver Island in summer, that means it's already starting to get light outside. So get off that couch and make yourself another cup of coffee. Start munching on another chocolate donut. Because you have to be back on the water with me at 4 a.m. testing out these brand new homemade topwater lures made out of super cyper cedar. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.